Hello and welcome back to Up the Villa. I'm delighted to be joined by Craig King, a Swiss football expert. How you doing, mate?
Yeah, I'm all good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's great to have you on because I imagine there's a lot of Villa fans, me included, who probably haven't really watched much of Young Boys or the Swiss League in general. So just talk to me a little bit about Young Boys, their history, sort of like who are they, and how prevalent are they within Swiss football?
Yeah, so their success recently over the last 10 years or so is it's a new thing. You know, they've been successful in the past, like a lot of Swiss clubs have been, like Servette and teams like that who kind of fell away. And I think a lot of people know that Basel were the team for such a long time. They were the one that was kind of flying the flag in Europe and they were winning so many titles. And then Young Boys kind of came out of nowhere in the 2017-2018 season to win that title. And then they kept going from there. They kind of took over Basel's place. You know, there was a lot of periods during that time when Basel were dominating where people were like, you know, this isn't good for the league. You need another team here to challenge. It's basically a one-horse race every season. And then that happened when Young Boys challenged, but then Young Boys just came and did what Basel had done for the last 10 years before that. So, yeah, they've kind of taken that place. But on that kind of topic, they've not really replaced Basel in Europe. You know, Basel had all that success for that lengthy period of time. You know, they were doing well in Europa League, got into the knockout stages of the Champions League many times. Young Boys haven't really done that very often. So that's kind of been the step that's been missing for them over these last 10 years or so. And again, it feels like that might not happen this season because they've had a really quite ridiculous start to the season as well. But yeah, Young Boys are the team now currently. But again, you've had Zurich a couple of years ago. They randomly won the title from nowhere. So it's getting more unpredictable, I'd say. There was a kind of three-horse race last season as well between Young Boys, Servette and Lugano right till the end of the season. So the league itself is getting more exciting, which is only a good thing, of course. It's kind of what everybody was hoping for since Basel's run of dominance. So yeah, it's definitely a good thing for the league.
Yeah, and what's sort of been the pointer that has made them sort of become that club that's been challenging in recent years? Is it sort of like money in that league that can sort of get you over the line, or is it just the way that they're playing, the structure?
Yeah, well, money in Swiss football isn't particularly great. You know, I think Basel had the kind of stranglehold for such a long time because they were so well known for developing players and selling them on for big fees. You know, all those players like Shaqiri and Xhaka and Sommer, all those kind of well-known Swiss players came through Basel, came through the youth system, and then were sold on for big fees. Even Mo Salah went to Basel as an unknown. He wasn't particularly good at finishing, believe it or not, when he signed for them, but then he progressed and he was sold for big money. And obviously you can see what he's doing now. And then Basel kind of stopped doing that. There was a lot of changes at a top level. The president left the club. He was a very well-liked president, did so well over that period of time. He left, and the changes after that didn't really help them so much, and they didn't make good moves in the transfer market. They didn't really develop players like they had been in the past. So it left that opportunity for another team. And Young Boys kind of were that second team for a while, but there was always a mentality thing with them that they used to always kind of get close to doing something, you know, special, and then just at the last kind of falling away. But yeah, that gap opened up when Basel started kind of making those decisions that weren't particularly helpful to them at the higher level, at the boardroom level. And Young Boys took that opportunity. They took a more structured approach. Some of their signings were obviously a lot better and all that sort of stuff. There was more patience about them. And then that season when they won that title, you know, it's just kind of the perfect storm. Basel were falling away and Young Boys were the team that could then progress and take the title. And they kind of built from there. And of course, they've now qualified for the Champions League 4 times since they won that title. So that only helps. They're getting that Champions League money that's, you know, as you know, astronomical. So it's a world away from the rest of the Swiss clubs who are playing in the Europa League or Conference League. So that can only help them as well. But honestly, I think when you think about Basel then, and even Young Boys a couple of years ago when they lost the title to Zurich, and even, you know, this season when they're not doing so well, I think it comes back to complacency. And I think that's happening again with Young Boys now. I think, you know, they get in a position of such dominance that they don't really take any warnings that are coming, and they think it's just going to last forever, and it doesn't. So that's something that seems to be coming up again now.
Yeah, so what's their sort of style of play? I probably better to talk about what it was like last season, because this season, like you say, it's not started the best. And sort of like, who's their manager? What type of manager is he? And how's the football?
Yeah, so I mean, even last season, there was spells where it wasn't particularly good. You know, they were in that 3-horse race for the title, and they struggled at times. But generally, they are a very attacking team. They've got a lot of fast players, especially in attack, you know, that they can counter teams very well. And yeah, so they've always been the kind of team, as you'd imagine, the dominant team on the front foot, especially in the domestic league. In Europe, kind of more conservative, you know, they can hurt teams. They showed that in the Champions League last season against Man City at home. They scored against Leipzig at home. They scored, they beat Red Star in that group as well. So they can definitely score goals and attack teams, but you know that on the other side of that, their defensive play for, you know, even last season, especially this season, and in Europe has always been kind of an Achilles heel. But they're just very unpredictable as well, because against Galatasaray at home, in the qualifiers this season, they conceded two goals after being 2-0 up, and then they went away to Istanbul and won 1-0 easily. Well, not easily, but they were pretty comfortable, you know, and they kept the clean sheet pretty comfortably as well. So it's really difficult sometimes to pinpoint what that team's going to turn up, what team's going to turn up. You know, they're quite erratic. As for the manager, you know, it's Patrick Raman who's come in. He was manager of Winterthur last season, who were newly promoted a couple of seasons ago. He used to be Basel manager for a short period of time, but he took them over last season, took them into the top half of the league, which was quite a phenomenal achievement. And then he took that step up to young boys, but it's really not worked out well. He's bought himself some credit with the Galatasaray result, but overall, I think he's, you know, under quite a lot of pressure right now. You know, the results just aren't there for him, and he's not really the most attacking manager, I would say. You know, his teams can be exciting, but this season it's not really happening. You know, for a young boys team packed with the kind of attacking talent that they have, they've not really shown it at times, and that's probably the most worrying aspect, because, as I say, this is a team that's been so dominant for so long. And there's been more than one game where they've not really looked up to it, you know, attacking wise. They've just looked so toothless when they've got quality players that can really hurt teams. So that's a worry going forward. And I think all of this is just coming a bit too soon. The new manager, it's not really, whatever style he's trying to implement here, it's not really working for them so far. Again, I don't really know how they got through those qualifiers. It's the only games they've won this season, apart from cup games against division amateur teams, you know. So it just kind of, it's one of those things where you just wonder how football actually works. But yeah, I think all of this is just coming a little bit too soon, and maybe it will come good, but there's just so much kind of pressure, especially on the domestic front. You know, European Football Champions League especially is a bonus at this point. But yeah, there's a kind of feeling around the club that, you know, when's it going to turn? You kind of expected it after Galatasaray. They won both of those games. They didn't play in between those two legs, and then they played Lausanne at home the following week, and it was probably one of the worst home performances I've seen for a long time. They had one shot on target, it was a goal, and they drew 1 each. They really should have lost that game, and they've already lost at home this season as well, and that's something that doesn't happen very often in the league. You know, they've went on stretches where they've lost, you know, one game in like 3 years at home and things like that. So yeah, there's just a lot of question marks over the team and the manager at this point.
Yeah, and the pitch is artificial, isn't it? And Martinez, after the game against Everton for Villa, mentioned the pitch. So if he's mentioning it, I'll mention it. So what's it like for the opposing teams, especially like teams in Europe playing on that pitch? You mentioned that they played Man City last season. Have they played any other Premier League team in sort of Europe in the last couple of years?
Yeah, so this is going back a wee bit further, but people might remember they played Tottenham in, I think it was 2011, 2010 maybe, and they won that game and then lost the second leg quite heavily. They beat Manchester United a few years ago, a last-minute goal, and they've played Everton and Liverpool. They lost both of those games. So they've had quite a few dealings with English teams as well. They also played Rangers, of course, for British opposition there as well. And they've generally done all right at home. You know, I think that the plastic pitch is a massive help. They don't lose many games in Europe unless it's really against the bigger teams. They've played teams like Leverkusen, Napoli, Shakhtar, all these teams, and beat them. You know, drew with Atalanta. So they are hard to beat at home, and I think that artificial pitch is a massive part of that. You know, it's a good atmosphere, and the crowd really gets behind them there. But I think the artificial pitch is something that's always kind of been a leveler for them, and it might be again here. You know, I feel like it shouldn't be. You know, it's not a bad plastic pitch, and they're not ideal, of course, but yeah, I feel like teams just seem to struggle on it for whatever reason, and I think that's also why there's such a huge discrepancy in terms of young boys' home results and their typical away results in Europe. You know, they've played teams away from home in Europe and been heavily beaten, but at home they've managed to, you know, get a good result. And Manchester United games are examples of that as well. The Tottenham game as well. So yeah, the artificial pitch I think is probably the main concern I would say for Aston Villa going into this game, because it's just not ideal. You know, you shouldn't really be playing top level European games on it. But again, if it helps the home team, then they're not going to care, to be quite honest.
No, definitely not. And when we was in the Conference League, we opened up against a very hostile Legia Warsaw, and yeah, it was a tough night for Villa. Sort of first night back in Europe for a number of years. What can we expect from the crowd? Sort of on a hostile 1 to 10 rating, where would you put the home atmosphere?
I would probably say seven or eight. Maybe 6 or 7. I don't. It's not as hostile as, you know, places like in Poland or, you know, Serbia, all these places. But I think when it's packed out, which it will be, you know, the crowds always come, and it's the English teams coming to Bern. Yeah, I think it's going to be a great atmosphere. It was an electric atmosphere against Galatasaray, and that certainly helped the team up the levels. And I think that'll be the same here again. It will need to be, I think, if young boys are to get a result from the game. And I think, you know, Aston Villa will probably adapt to it okay. You know, it's not, as I say, it's not the most hostile, but I think they'll definitely be behind the team. And I think that should help young boys raise their levels, because quite honestly, that home game against Galatasaray is the only game really this season that they've really looked like they could go and score, you know, 4 or 5 goals. That game they could have been 4-0 up before they suddenly kind of fell apart, and they edged it out in the end 3-2 with a controversial penalty. So yeah, the home crowd is going to be massive for them. The home advantage massive for them. That's the only way they can really get a result from Aston Villa, I believe. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see if they up the levels again, because, like I say, it's not been there for the rest of the season, and that's not a good thing either, because you can't just turn up for these games either. In Champions League, you need to do it all season, and just not been doing that.
Yeah, who should we watch out for? Are there any sort of like key players that Villa fans should keep their eye on?
Yeah, so I would say Filip Begrinich, who is a Swiss international. He's got only 2 caps, but he's had quite a few injuries. He was on the bench for the 2 Nations League games just past. He's a player that I think will play a lot more in the future, but he's probably been the most consistent player for them this season, and maybe last season as well. He was very, very good against Galatasaray. Joe Montero, who's just been capped in that recent international break for Switzerland, he's another player that scored a lot of goals last season, kind of burst onto the scene. And again, this season, he's actually got 6 assists in 2 Swiss Cup games, which I know they played amateur opposition, but it's quite a remarkable feat to get 6 and 2. And yeah, he was good as well. In that home leg against Galatasaray, he scored 2 goals. He's probably going to be the main goal threat. But there's quite a few players in that young boys team. Misha Kelia, who's been there for a few years now, played in a lot of European campaigns. I think he might have actually played in every Champions League campaign so far for young boys. He scored a great goal against Man City. He scored against Leipzig as well. He's not been really in the first team as much, but he's a player that can definitely come off the bench, cause problems. Also, Alan Virginius, who's a new signing on loan. He's played a lot in the war leagues of France, but he came in and scored that goal away to Galatasaray. He'd only played in the Cup before that, and then he came and scored the goal to send him into the Champions League. So he's another player to watch. But again, all these players are the attacking players that I mentioned, and I don't want to be too negative, but again, it goes back to the fact that defensively there's just so many issues. I think they can score goals when they're on it, as they've shown in certain games. But I mean, they've been conceding like fun this season as well.
Yeah, Villa are a team that like to control games, control possession, How do you see this game going? We're sort of saying that they've got like defensive frailties. Do you see them sort of like trying to keep it tight, or are they going to try and just attack us, or are they going to play on transition?
I think that they'll be looking to kind of let Aston Villa control possession and try and hit them on the counter. Again, it worked quite well against Galatasaray. And although, to be fair, against Galatasaray, they were kind of surprising because they did, once they kind of got that first goal, they were attack after attack. But I don't know if that's going to be the same against Aston Villa. I think that would be quite naive to do that. I think Galatasaray themselves had a lot of defensive issues in that game. It's a very, very open game. And I think it would be quite foolish to do that against Aston Villa. But again, as I say, this team's so erratic, so unpredictable, it's hard to kind of say what one's going to turn up. But I would expect them, to concede the possession and try and hit in the counter. They've got that pace that I mentioned, that they can hurt teams and they can score goals. But also, I just don't think they can hold out at the back. If they try and just defend, they're going to come unstuck. I think they need to score the first goal in this game to have any chance. And it's possible, if they start fast, the crowd behind them, then they might have a chance. But I think Aston Villa really shouldn't have too much to fear if they come in and play their game, and the plastic pitch, hopefully for them, doesn't have too much of an impact.
What have you made of Villa in recent seasons, especially under Unai Emery?
It's funny because when I was younger, everybody used to have, of course, a second team, a Premier League team. And mine was Aston Villa. I remember years ago, I can't even remember what age, it would have been, like 11 or something. And they played Doncaster in the Cup and they get put out by Doncaster. And I remember I was out with friends and I'm like, no, I'm going to go home and watch this game. And I went home and I watched that game, and they obviously got beat. And I've not really, I never kept up that as I grew up, the support and everything else. But it's always been a great club that should be in the Premier League, and the years where they weren't and stuff just is certainly not ideal. So it's good to see that the rise. It's been quite a fast rise since they came back up to now be playing in Europe, playing the Champions League again. I don't think anybody would have expected that to happen so fast. And yeah, in a really good place. So as much as all this is a bonus for young boys playing in the Champions League, I think for Aston Villa, obviously you want to do well and get through. I think just being back at that level must be a really great thing for the club and the supporters as well.
Yeah, it's absolutely massive. I mean, with your accent, you must be a McGinn fan. You must like McGinn.
Yeah. Although it's been tough the last few months, since pretty much since the Euros, it's been quite difficult to like any of them. But he's been excellent for Scotland for the most part as well.
Yeah, he's a good player. So just touch on it finally. Sort of like, where would you rank sort of like Swiss football, like especially this side? Like, where would you, a comparison of where would they be in the Premier League if they were in the Premier League or in English football?
I've never, in all the podcasts I've done, I've never been asked that question. Great question. It's hard to kind of pinpoint. I always put the league on a similar kind of level as Scotland. That's one I can always compare it to, obviously. But then I feel like it's also very underrated. I think a lot of people, it just flies under the radar. People don't really recognise Swiss football at all. Even like the similar level leagues like Belgium and places like that, there's always those kind of a bigger selection of bigger teams, whereas in Switzerland you've only really got Basel, Young Boys, maybe Zurich, teams like that. You would struggle to name more teams than that, so it kind of flies under the radar. But yeah, these teams, all the Swiss teams have been capable of some really great results in Europe. I think if they're playing week in, week out in the Premier League, it'd be a real struggle. I think they'd be definitely near the bottom half. Maybe again, it comes back to the fact they'd have a lot more money, so maybe they'd be able to deliver with that. Maybe Basel Young Boys would do a bit better, and maybe the mid-table or top half. But I think everybody else would really struggle. Yeah,
well, it's been great chatting to you, Craig, because I have literally no clue on Swiss football. And I put the tweet out and I was like, does anyone know an expert? And you were the go-to guy. So, just thank you for joining me. And hopefully, if we ever play a team in Switzerland again, then hopefully you can come on again, mate.
Yeah, I'd love to. And just on that point, like, I bet you didn't expect it to be someone Scottish talking about Swiss football. So, yeah, it's unusual what you find.
Yeah, I mean, fine. How did you sort of get into it then? Like, how are you so sort of like zoned in on it?
Yeah, I guess kind of by accident. You know, years ago I was wanting to watch Champions League game, and back then I think they still do it. You know, you had so many choices you could pick, like press the red button and pick like whatever game you wanted, and there was big games on that night if I remember, and I thought, you know, I'm not going to watch one of those. I'll pick a random different game. And Basel were playing a Romanian team that doesn't exist anymore. And I remember Basel's kits, you know, the red and blue, and I thought, you know, I quite like those kits. I'll put that game on, and I watched it and they won. And then again, just kind of impulse, I thought, you know, I'll just try and watch their games and keep track of them. You know, it's a bit different, quite hipster, you know, following this other team. You know, quite stupid, but I did that. And the next game they played Manchester United at Old Trafford, and I'll often wonder what would have happened, you know, if they'd been beaten as expected heavily, if I'd have just lost interest because I had no real kind of connection with them. And they lost, they drew that game, in the last minute. They were winning 3-2. And after that, I just, you know, kept watching their games whenever I could. And then I started the Twitter account that covers all of Swiss football. I thought, you know, see if this goes anywhere, because, you know, there's places in English for all the other kind of smaller leagues. I thought I'll try that and see what happens. And then I just started watching everything. So now, all this time later, you know, I watched pretty much most teams, you know, and the national team and the women's team. And, you know, it's went further than I ever expected. I've been over there now, made some friends there. I've been to see the men's team at Wembley. I've been to see the women's team when they played at the Euros and in England as well. So yeah, it's been a bit mad, you know, and there's been opportunities that I've had off the back of that, you know, to go on like Sky Sports and stuff, which just still blows my mind, you know. I never expected anything like that to happen. So yeah, just from turning that game on all those years ago, and then yeah, now I'm just talking about Swiss football. I know far more about it than I should ever know, to be honest.
Yeah, I love it. So Villa fans, go. I'll put the your socials in the description to the video as well. So everyone go and show Craig's Twitter some love and just follow his journey with Swiss football. So thanks for coming on, mate.
No worries. Thanks again for having me. Take care, mate.